Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's Department of Communication Colloquium. As you can see, Dr. Raim is already here. And by the way, I am Wang Liao, assistant professor here at UW. And I'm truly delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Steve Rains. Dr. Rain is a professor of communication at the University of Arizona, and today he will share his insight, as listed here, communicating emotional support, offline and online. But before that, let me give you a little bit more introduction of him. Dr. Rain's research spans health communication, social influence, and communication technology. He studies how and why message influence people, especially in health context and digital environments. In recent years, his work has focused on social support, and he has also explored topics such as online coping, incivility, and resistance to persuasion. He is particularly interested in leveraging computational social science techniques to better understand the dynamics communication process involved in these phenomena. And I have to say, Dr. Rain is a really highly productive and impactful scholar. He is the author of the insightful book, Coping with Illness Digitally, published by MIT Press. And he has also co-authored more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. Hopefully I counted right. There's a lot. He is also a fellow of the International Communication Association and currently serves as co-editor of Communication Research, a really prestigious journal in our field, which is just a reflection of his leadership and influence here. And just a little bit more on a personal note, I have to admit I never met Dr. Rains in person before, but actually I followed his work for quite some time, ever since I was joined grad school. I remember I first encountered Steve's work on anonymity, and that was really a fresh air because at the time, many things that I read was quite leaning into media psychology, but his more social interaction-oriented approach really stood out to me. And then when I first started as an assistant professor, one of my colleagues happens to be his students, and I learned so many good stories about his mentorship and scholarship. And that really made me curious about him. And as I become increasingly interested in studying social influence and online communities, I just kept encountering his research times after time again. And more recently, I noticed that he started to work on supportive communication in online space that really struck a particular chord on me. So at that point, I felt I had to reach out and invite him to speak. And as I mentioned before, I believe that Dr. Rain's work resonates with several areas of interest in this department, right, including health communication and online community. So I'm especially glad we have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Rain today. Just a little bit of the procedural. As usual, we will begin with Dr. Rain's presentation, followed by a Q&A session. After that, Dr. Rain has kindly agreed to stay with us for a more informal discussion, just to share his experience as both researcher and editors of communication research. So I encourage everyone, especially grad students, to stick around, ask questions, and take advantage of this opportunity. All right, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Rains.
Thanks, Wang. I appreciate it. That was a very, very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for your time today. I appreciate the opportunity to get to share some of my work with you and some of the work that my team and I have done over these past several years. So one of the things that I've had a longstanding interest in is this idea of social support and how it plays out in online and offline. And so what I thought I would do today is talk about a couple of different trajectories of research that my team and I have worked on over the past couple of years in hopes that it might spur interest in others. So, one of the things in saying that I'm interested in social support, I'm sure that there are at least a couple of people who are saying on this call who are saying me too, because social support is one of the most studied topics in academia. I would guess that you could go to 15 different departments on your campus and find people studying social support. You certainly can here. So you can find people from business to medicine, public health, education, certainly in a number of the different social sciences, even in some of the physical sciences. So what we're all studying in studying social support, I think, is this idea that there's a connection between people's social relationships and their well-being. And so at the broadest level, I tend to think about social support is that intersection between relationships and well-being. And then under it, I think we have some very I think we have some sub areas of agreement that represent different kind of theoretical traditions of studying social support. So there's a social integration perspective, which is largely comes out of sociology and is focused on networks. So we can think about if someone is situated in a social network, what kind of resources can they draw from that? And how does the structure of their network shape the resources to which they have access? There's the social availability tradition, and that comes out of psych. And what it involves is the notion that just perceiving that others are available to provide resources can make me more robust to stressors. So just by knowing that I have someone to turn to for comfort or advice can make a stressor less insurmountable or seem less insurmountable. Last but not least, there's a tradition of scholarship focused on supportive communication, and this focuses on the message people use in producing and receiving aid. And I've kind of separated these as, you've heard me say, this is kind of a sociological approach, this is psychological, this is comm. Comm folks are doing support work in all these areas. I've worked across each of them. So I don't want to make it seem like they're exclusive to particular academic domains. We, as comm folks, do work in all the areas. What I want to spotlight today, though, is research on supportive communication, because that's where I've spent a great deal of time. And in particular, I want to give you a little bit of background that forms the foundation for my team's work, looking at emotional support in particular. So emotional support is simply support that that's provided to people who are experiencing negative feelings, distress. And these can range from anger to just being in a bad mood. But this kind of support is aimed at ameliorating that distress. So within the body of research on emotional support, the most widely studied construct is something called person-centeredness. And person-centeredness was developed by Burleson in the early 80s. And his students and his colleagues did a really nice job building it out. And person-centeredness is just generally adapting to the communication context and the individual and trying to provide aid that is unique to them. That's the operational term, the operational definition. The reason I've been drawn to this construct is because it also has a very concrete, that's the conceptual definition. The reason I've been drawn to this construct is because it has a very concrete operational definition, in that Burleson identifies these three levels of person-centeredness. Low person-centeredness involves denying or criticizing feelings. Moderate person-centeredness is this implicit recognition of feelings, and high person-centeredness is legitimizing and helping a recipient to better understand their feelings. So person-centeredness then ranges from we're trying to criticize someone for having negative feelings, or validating and helping one to better understand on the other end of that pole. So I think it might be helpful if we put this into an example to show how person-centeredness works. So I know that everyone in this room has someone they care about. Imagine you go to that person and say, hey, I'm really upset about what just happened. That person might say, you're overreacting about the whole thing. Don't worry about it. That would be low person-centeredness, because what that message does is it criticizes you for being upset. It says you're overreacting. Your feelings are not valid here. Moderate person-centeredness would be something like, I can't believe that happened. I'm sorry to hear that. So there's the implicit recognition that you're feeling something negative, but it's not really discussed explicitly. High person-centeredness then involves the explicit validation of someone's feelings. So it might take the form of, you have every right to be upset. That was not normal. So here it's making it clear that, yeah, your feelings are justified. So this low, moderate, high, you can see I've held constant the word count. So they're all 11 words, but what's different is the rhetorical move inside of the message. Low person-centeredness involves denying and criticizing someone for their feelings, whereas high is about justifying and validating those feelings. Now, I know you might think, we're kind of spoiled, I think, as comm folks, in the sense that I know I'm biased, but I think if this would be borne out in data, that I think comm folks are a little more skilled communicatively than the rest of the population. So you might be saying, well, who would say this? Who would say a low verbal person-centered message? Like, why would someone do that? And what I would argue is that although I can't necessarily explain why in the moment, I can say that I'm fairly confident this happens all the time. And I just encourage you to think back to your last family party. And if you were to just be a fly on the wall listening to the way people talk, my guess would be if you're like 90% of families, you're going to hear someone say, oh, you're overreacting, you're blowing this out of proportion. So we do say these kind of messages to people, I think, quite a bit in everyday life, and they have potentially important implications for coping. So if we can bring this back to research on verbal person-centeredness, Andy High and Jim Dillard did a really nice meta-analysis about 10 years ago. And a meta-analysis is simply a quantitative literature review. So what they did is they found 23 studies, K is the number of studies, and they looked at the relationship, the correlation between the level of person-centeredness and positive support outcomes. And so what a meta-analysis is then is we do that for each individual studies, we pull out that relationship, and then we aggregate them across all studies in the sample, in this case 23. What they found was an effect size of 0.61, and the R is scaled between 0 and 1, and 0.61 is absolutely massive. My guess would be that most folks will go their entire career without seeing an R value of 0.61. It's truly extraordinary. I worked with some colleagues where we synthesized all meta-analyses published in COM before 2015. There were like 150, and I think 0.61 is like the fourth largest effect. So the reason I get hung up on this is because what this suggests to me is that verbal person-centeredness is a very potent construct. Telling someone that their feelings, they're overreacting relative to telling them that, yeah, your feelings seems pretty reasonably upset, is a very impactful and potentially helpful or harmful to their coping efforts. So person-centeredness then is the, and Burleson and his colleagues, these are the giant shoulders that my team and I have been trying to stand on. So what we do is we've used person-centeredness as kind of a jumping off point for our research. And what I want to do today is talk about 3 trajectories or 3 programs of research we've been working on, looking at the scope and mechanisms of person-centeredness, how person-centeredness unfolds during conversation, and then finally looking at this idea of what we're calling collective support provision in online contexts. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the excellent collaborators I've had the opportunity to work with. Chelsea Akers, Anjali Ashtraputri, Joe Benito, Shelby Carter, Bethany Lutovsky, Kat Numkova, Corey Pavlich, and Eric Tetsi. Everyone except Joe Benito was a graduate student who I had the good fortune of working with. And Joe Benito is my colleague in the department, and he is also a whiz on nested data. And so he helped out with the second line of studies we'll talk about. So the first study then is the scope and mechanisms of person-centeredness. And what we were looking at here is, why does person-centeredness bring about effects? And are there situations when, how far can we extend the scope of these effects? And so the jumping off point for this was some work that Suzanne Jones did and John Wirtz. And what they argued is that the reason person-centeredness is beneficial is because it fosters reappraisal. So the operating mechanism is, and this comes out of the theory of conversationally induced reappraisals, is that through talking about our feelings, we come to see those feelings in a new light, and that makes us feel better. And so what Jones and Wirtz did is they did this really cool study. They brought people into a lab. They had a Confederate give high, medium, or low person-centered responses to a undergraduate talking about problems. What they found was that, as you can see in the model, person-centeredness led participants to talk about positive feelings, which led to reappraisal, which led to emotional improvement. So this found evidence that, yeah, reappraisal is a mechanism. Now, this hasn't been replicated very much. Graham Bodie did a nice study, but his was in the context of hypothetical scenarios. It wasn't an actual interaction, but he found the same thing as Jones and Wirtz, which is reappraisal did mediate the effects of person-centeredness. But one thing stood out to my team and I, which is that the direct effect of person-centeredness on emotional improvement is still significant. So graduate students who do quantitative methods, think about this for a second. You accounted for the mediator. So you've accounted for the effects of person-centeredness on improvement through reappraisal. And the direct effect is still significant. What does that tell us? It tells us that there's something going on, that they didn't get it all. That yes, reappraisal absolutely is a mediator, but there may be something else going on. And so what my team and I wanted to do was look at validation as another mechanism. It's in the definition of person-centeredness, is that these messages are designed to validate people's feelings. And so if you look, there's a little bit of literature in psych showing that when you validate people's feelings, that makes them feel better. And it just makes sense from an intuitive perspective as well. If you think about it, when somebody tells you, you say, I'm upset, and someone says, yeah, you have every reason to be upset. That makes you feel like you're not overreacting, that your response is reasonable. So we argued that validation might be another mechanism we wanted to test. The other thing is we wanted to do is we had read Burleson and Goldsmith's piece, which is they have this theory of conversationally induced reappraisal. It talks about the rhetorical moves you need to do to help people engage in reappraisal and feel better. It explains person-centeredness. And they've got this great line in there. They say that there are no magic bullet words or phrases that will reliably bring about relief to victims of emotional distress. So you can't just say anything generic. It has to be heartfelt and situation specific and all this stuff. And we read this and we thought, that effect size was R equals 6.3 is pretty big. I don't know. I bet you there are generic things you can say. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to see is if we could take the person out of person-centeredness, and what happens if what happens if a chatbot provides you with high and low person-centered responses? Would we see the same effects? So could we remove the person from person-centeredness and observe the same outcomes? So what we did is we conducted a series of studies. I'm going to tell you about one, but they all followed this same basic form. We had students come into the lab, and then we randomly assigned them to interact with the chatbot, and the chatbot provided either high or low person-centeredness. Participants rated their stressor before the interaction, talked with the chatbot, received high or low PC feedback, and then completed some measures where they reported perceived validation, reappraisal, and then they reported their stress level again, or their feelings about the stressor again. And so I want to show you the chatbot we came up with. This is ListenerBot. And our goal here, if you think about a lot of human-computer interaction, it's designed to make chatbots seem as human-like as possible. Well, we wanted to make it the opposite. We wanted to make sure that people knew you are not interacting with a human, you are interacting with a very, very basic chatbot. So we created ListenerBot, and ListenerBot is really just a series of, originally it was a series of PowerPoints, and then it became like a series of CSS basic script. But what happened was they would click on start, they would get this message that said it's ListenerBot's being initialized, and then they were asked to engage in this back and forth it consisted of about 5 questions from ListenerBot. After each question, they received either high or low person-centered support. So here's the first one. I'm ListenerBot. I'm here to talk about problems. Can you please tell me about your problem? What specifically is going on? Please type proceed. So a participant would type their response, and then they would receive either high or low person-centered support. So as this is coming up, I'll tell you that we did, we randomized the order of the exact messages so that, we try to do all those things in an experiment that would make it a rigorous experiment. And the high person-centered response, here's high, I'm so sorry to hear about your troubles. This sounds like a difficult situation. I can see why it'd be stressful. So this is validating their feelings. Low person-centered, this does not seem like something to get worked up about. You were an adult and should have known that things like this can happen. So here we're denying and criticizing their feelings. The next one, how does the situation make you feel? So then after that, they received another 2 responses. High was, I completely understand why you'd feel that way. I bet this will be a learning experience that you will benefit from in the future. So we're trying to foster reappraisal. We're trying to say, let's look at this situation in a new light. Low PC, it seems like you are overreacting or exaggerating the problem. You seem like someone who tends to be overly sensitive. So this is a low PC, again, denying, criticizing feelings. So they went through 5 rounds of this, and then they completed the post-test measures. And what did we find? We found in general, that high person-centeredness led to more positive outcomes than low person-centeredness. It led to greater feelings of validation. It led to greater reappraisal, and it led to greater distress reduction. I will note there that effect size of R equals 0.14 is much smaller than we see in the studies from Dillard and High's meta-analysis. But if you look at just the studies where there's human interaction or where verbal person-centeredness is not manipulated in the context of a scenario, but in the context of actual discussion, it's closer to what they see. So can you take the person out of person-centeredness? These data provide some evidence that you can. So what about the mechanisms? So here, I know there's a lot here, but really what we have is person-centeredness leads to talk about problems, which leads to reappraisal, which leads to distress reduction. So it didn't lead to any of these talk-related variables. What it did do, though, is it led to validated feelings, and validated feelings led to reappraisal, which led to distress reduction. So some of this may be a difference in context where you're talking to a computer and not a human. But what we found essentially is evidence that validating feelings is a key mechanism. The other thing I want to point out is that after counting for validated feelings, there's no longer this direct effect between person-centeredness and distress reduction. So what this seems to suggest is, at least in this context of human-computer interaction, validating feelings is an important way in which high person-centeredness leads to a reduction in distress. People feel like, oh, my feeling's reasonable. That leads them to engage in reappraisal, which in turn leads them to feel better. So we replicated this in several different studies. So the one I showed you was study 1 of a 2-study manuscript, and then we conducted a couple of other studies, and we basically consistently found the same thing. We found that high person-centeredness was more effective than low person-centeredness, and we found that validation was a key mechanism. So the 2 takeaways I think there are from this research are that there are magic bullet words or phrases that will reliably bring about relief from emotional distress. If we can just teach people to say, yeah, your feelings are justified, or better yet, I think it would be even better if we told people, please don't ever tell someone that they're overreacting. Just don't do that. I think that would be very beneficial. And the other contribution here, I think, is that, validation is part of the reason that high levels of person-centeredness bring about relief from distress. So that's the first line of research. One of the things, we got to the end of this and we started thinking that, a lot of the research on person-centeredness is all focused on the effects of the support message. So what I mean by that is it's almost like a message effects line of scholarship where let's see how high versus low works, and then maybe why, or when it works better or worse. And that's great. We need that, absolutely. But one of the things we got to wondering about is, well, what about support seekers? What role do they play in these interactions? And so what we began that led us down this path of looking at, well, maybe the kind of person-centeredness people get is contingent upon the way they behave as seekers. And that led us to the second line of research focusing on conversational processes of person-centeredness. So we know that supportive communication is a dynamic process like any kind of interpersonal communication. So if you think about it, we can break an interaction down between 2 people most of the time, virtually all the time, between I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. Our interaction is chunked into turns, and a turn is simply uninterrupted speech. So I talk, I tell you about my problem, and my turn ends when you start talking, and then your turn ends when I start talking. So every interaction, we can break it down like this. And this is important, I think, because what it suggests is that although it's valuable to understand the effects of person-centeredness, we need to also look at how that is co-constructed in interaction. So what I mean by this is a conversation is not simply what I want to get out of it as a support seeker, but it's a dance I'm doing with providers in order to see what we can work together to accomplish. We wanted to try to study that in the context of supportive conversation and see how that dance plays out. So what we wanted to do is look at how they unfold between the interdependent behavior of seekers and providers. Rather than just looking at message effects, we want to look at the conversation itself and what and how people are co-constructing it. So what we had done is we had a series of lab studies where we brought people into a lab and we had them talk about problems. We manipulate several things. What we had done is we had coded for some kinds of support seeking and kinds of support provision. I want to talk about just two things. Dana Goldsmith, a long time ago, back in 1995, made this really nice distinction between approach and avoidance in support seeking. So as a support seeker, I can move toward my problem in terms of I can talk about the facts, I can talk about my feelings, or I can engage in avoidance and move away from it. And so approach and avoidance goes back to the very beginning of coping research more generally. We're either moving toward or away from a stressor. And in the case of avoidance in support seeking, it might take the form of downplaying a problem or changing the subject. If you ask me like, oh, I'm sorry you're really stressed, and I can be like, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Or I can say, yeah, why don't we just go see a movie later? So I can do things to not talk about the problem, or I can do things to talk about the problem as a support seeker. Providers, though, we know that one of the major ways providers can be helpful is through person-centeredness. They can provide low or not helpful. In the case of low, so these are messages that would deny feelings. Moderate would be this implicit recognition of feelings, and then high person-centeredness would be this explicit recognition of feelings. So what we had done is we conducted a series of lab studies, and we took data from two of them. And the basic premise of the study was two undergraduates come into the lab and they're randomly assigned to be either a seeker or a provider. And a support seeker we called a talker, and a provider we called a confidant. And then we asked them to talk about a stressor that they were having related to work, relationships. It was academics, relationships, or finances. And so then what we did is we took all their talk and we transcribed it, and then we coded it. And so we coded the seeker's talk for approach and avoidance behaviors, and we coded the provider's talk for a level of person-centeredness. So across these two experiments, we had 334 dyads, and the conversations then range between 1 and 181 turns. We had about 5,000 total turns. So we had a lot of back and forth, coded as in the context of seeking messages and provision messages. So then the analysis, I know this looks like a lot, but I promise it's not. The analysis was, in order to study this back and forth, what we had to do is we conducted a form of some interpersonal quantitative folks might see this. It looks like an actor-partner dependence model, is because it is. It's a longitudinal version. And what we have is that we have a support seeker's message at the previous message, and then we have their next message, and then we have a provider's previous message and their next message. What we're really looking at, though, is this is called a stability influence model, and we're looking at the influence portion. So how does what a seeker says influence the next provider's message? And how does the provider's message influence the next thing a seeker says? So what this model lets us get at is how my talk affects your response, and then how your talk affects my response. So it really does get at this back and forth in interaction. When I say X, how do you respond? And when you say Y, how do I respond? So here's what we found. We found, what I want to highlight is these cycles. One is a virtuous cycle, and the second is we're going to call a vicious cycle. So the virtuous cycle, involved this connection between approach behaviors from seekers and provider person-centeredness. So you can see the green arrow. When seekers used approach behaviors, providers, you can read this like a regression coefficient, unstandardized, providers produced higher levels of person-centeredness. I've kind of plotted this in a different way. It's the same thing. I just want to show you, illustrate it in a different way to see if that's more helpful. On the X, we have approach behaviors. Can you see my the cursor? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So on the X, we have approach behaviors, and you can see when approach behaviors are present, this red, it looks like an I is a mean with a confidence interval around it, and the background is the raw data. And then on the Y, we have person-centeredness and the provider's response. And so what we can see is that when approach behaviors are present, providers produced higher levels of person-centeredness than when approach behaviors are absent. Now, we also found that when support providers produced higher levels of person-centeredness, support seekers also were more likely to produce approach behaviors. So this plot is kind of flipped. You see provider person-centeredness on the bottom and seeker behaviors on the y-axis. And you can see that when person-centeredness is higher, approach behaviors were more likely to be present in that term. You can see that estimate and confidence interval is a little bit further to the right. So what this shows us then is we've got this back and forth that forms a cycle. Seekers talk about their feelings, providers offer higher person-centered feedback, providers offer higher person-centered feedback, seekers talk about their feelings. So you can see how this interaction is kind of like a loop where I share what's going on, you provide better feedback, which leads me to share what's going on, which leads you to provide better feedback. So what I want to really underscore here is that they're working together. Seekers and providers are working together to produce a helpful conversation. So we also found that seekers and providers are also willing to work together to provide an unhelpful conversation, but I'm going to add a little bit of caveat to what I mean by unhelpful. So here we found a vicious cycle, which is a connection between avoidance and person-centeredness. When support seekers avoided, providers provided lower quality person support. So again, avoidance is on the X, person-centeredness is on the Y. If you can see when avoidance is present, person-centeredness is lower. So relative to when it was absent. So if I avoid, you provide lower levels of person-centeredness. But also, when you provide lower levels of person-centeredness, I'm more likely to avoid. So as person-centeredness goes down, avoidance goes up. And you can see that in this plot here. As provider person-centeredness is higher, as it is lower, avoidance becomes more likely. So the lower person-centeredness, the more likely we get avoidance. And so one of the ways low person-centeredness takes a form in conversation, according to Jones, and this is the way we coded it based on some of Suzanne Jones and Graham Modi's work, is off-topic talk. So low person-centeredness could be off-topic talk or talk that's directed about me as a support provider. And so what we found in looking at the actual data in the conversation, looking at the text, is that support seekers and providers work together to not talk about the problem. So the way this would work would be a seeker would make an off-topic statement, which would be considered avoidance, trying to change the subject, and a provider would go along with it. So they would start talking about, oh, you went to this high school, I went to the other high school across town. Do you know so-and-so? Yeah, I know so-and-so. And so what they were doing is, because the seeker didn't want to talk about the problem, the provider was happy to accommodate them, and they both worked together to go off topic. So what this vicious cycle, I don't think it's as much as providers being mean and saying, you're overreacting, although that would happen too, as much as this off-topic talk serving to shift the conversations away from the problem. So now it's a supportive conversation. So if we're not talking about the problem, chances are I'm also not feeling better as a support seeker. So we replicated this study, or how do we use the word replicate? We looked at this data set and we looked at it in different ways. We looked at differences. I'm not going to get into the weeds on this. I just want to show you another context where we looked at this in face-to-face and instant messaging conversations. So you can see on the X here, we have person-centeredness, and on the Y, we have specific seeker behaviors. And what we looked at is these are turn level estimates. So we can see when some kind of turns are more likely than others. My point here is simply that this is an extension of that previous work, looking at how supportive conversation unfold and how support seekers and providers work together to make that happen. This is another study. Again, I'm trying to illustrate the trajectory here and not necessarily the specific findings. But what we looked at is when different types of conversational behavior occur over time in conversations. So if you split a conversation into 4 equal segments, so Wong and I talk and we have a conversation with 100 turns, each quartile will be 25. Katie and I talk and we have a conversation of 200 turns, each quartile would be 50. So we can make them even, and we would find that when these different behaviors become more or less likely. So for example, we found approach kind of behaviors a peak in the second quartile. The bottom plot is looking at person-centeredness. And we found that, for example, that low person-centeredness peaks in the third quartile. So this is, again, it's part of this broader trajectory of research, trying to understand how talk unfolds during conversation. What I want to highlight here, though, is what I think all this work shows us is that supportive conversations can be thought about as this process of mutual influence. So seekers affecting providers, providers affecting seekers, and together, providers and seekers working to co-construct meaning and to co-construct these supportive interactions, as well as, I would say, their outcomes. So that's the second trajectory of work. The third line of research we have going on looks at support provision as a collective process. The vast majority of research on social support, at least looking at person-centeredness, I think almost all of it assumes dyadic behavior. And so it assumes that support's given in the context of 2 people. And that makes sense, right? We know that strong ties are often our primary resource for social support. So there's good reason to look at dyads. But there are certain settings like online communities where social support is a collective effort. If you think about the number of people who turn to online resources for social support, it makes sense that we might want to consider it, how support happens in these collective contexts. And so what Shelby Carter and I did is we conducted a study to look at social support behavior among collectives as part of a broader dynamic system. So here we're trying to draw from some of the literature on systems, not to study networks per se, but to understand how these online communities function as these self-organizing entities where people who aren't planning to work together in a collaborative way like you might see on a team, a formal team in a business, but who are interdependent nonetheless, and who are in a less formal sense working together as in the context of providing aid. So I want to show you an example to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. This is a fibromyalgia support group. It's from Daily Strength. This is just a screenshot I took a couple of months ago. And what you see here is if you log on to the system, you would see this. And what you see here is this is a thread. And in a thread, for those of you who aren't familiar with online communities, people post an initial message and then folks respond to it. So Mix It Up Monday was posted by Leo, and Leo got 2 responses. Leo, who's very active in this community, also posted Women Weekend Check-In and received 6 responses there. So if I logged into this system and I clicked on Mix It Up Monday to see what that was about, I would find the initial message from Leo. And most of the time, these involve support seeking. We don't need to get into the weeds here, but the idea is structurally, you've got a message that starts the thread in which someone's seeking support, and then you get responses. So in this case, Leo had 2, Mickey 26 responded, And then later that same day, Fantod responded. And these responses then, this would be constitute the message starting the thread is support seeking generally, and the messages responding oftentimes are support provision. So the way this would appear if you scrolled through, and I understand you can't see the specifics, it doesn't really matter, but I just want you to see that this is the structure. So if I log into the system, I see it as Leo's message followed by these two messages. So what Mickey's message and Fantod's message are both separate people providing support. What we're arguing is that Mickey and Fantod aren't separate. They form an interdependent support provision system that we're calling a collective practice. So what I mean by collective, I simply mean separate people who all provide support to the same person within a thread, that can be its own unit of analysis. And it's different from dyads in the sense that these folks are separate, but at the same time interdependent in a way that is unique from dyads. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to take a look at how this collective support functions, what forms it takes, and then we wanted to look at its implications for coping. And so what we did was we downloaded about 33,000 threads from 24 different health communities. And so each thread would be like the first message by Leo and then all the responses. So we had about 200,000 messages total. And then what we did is we coded a sample, and then we used machine learning to scale up our coding. So essentially the machine learning part was we just used machine, as opposed to having a sample of like 500, which wouldn't have done us that much good in this context. We use machine learning as a way to replicate the behavior of human coders. So rather than having 500, we had a sample of 33,000 threads with 2,000 total messages. So in order to do this, though, we had to code in two parts. The first thing we did is we had to identify emotional support seeking messages, because person-centeredness doesn't really apply to advice, or it doesn't apply to, like, if you ask me for a ride to the doctor, I'm not talking about my feelings. In order for it to be appropriate, someone needs to be talking about their feelings. They need to engage in emotional support seeking. So we first coded threads to identify those in which people sought emotional support. And we defined emotional support as any talk about feelings. So this is an example of a message from our thread. I'm having a small flare. I'm in the middle of a yearly SAT attack. It's been almost 1 year since the anniversary of my sweeting's passing. I'm irritable, grumpy, and spoiling for a good argument. Does anybody get this way? A grumpy, smelly bundle of snippy. So I bolded the terms that we would latch onto and say, okay, they're talking about feelings. So the next thing we did is we coded then, we got all the person-centered, or we got all the emotional support messages, and then we went back and we coded all the responses for person-centeredness. Now, there were very few low person-centered messages. And so as a researcher, we were kind of frustrated. We were like, this is not good. As a human being, we were thrilled. We were like, this is fantastic. We don't see people denying and criticizing feelings. Online communities are a good place. A researcher, though, we would have loved to have them, but what we basically ended up with lots of moderate person-centered support. So in particular, level 5 and 6, and then lots of high. And so when we thought about it, it occurred to us that these are actually unique rhetorical moves, and so they're worth studying independently. So level 5 and 6 are both moderate person-centeredness, which is implicit recognition of feelings. Level 5 is a non-specific acknowledgement of feelings. So it would just be something like, I'm here if you need anything, friend. Level 6 is non-feeling centered explanation. So it looks a lot like advice that doesn't address feelings. It would be something like, yeah, definitely don't mess with your meds on your own. Talk to your PDoc about what to do. And then we lumped, because there were not enough levels of each 7, 8, 9. We just created one overall high person-centeredness category, and this included any message that explicitly acknowledged feelings, such as, OMG, I relate to this so much. I understand your lack of feeling fulfilled. I understand relationships feeling exhausting. I definitely understand feeling like you are not a priority. So all of these messages then explicitly acknowledge and recognize feelings. So the framework we were working on, dynamic systems theory, basically says that systems coalesce into these what they call attractor states. And attractor states are states that appear regularly. So what we did then is we took the first three messages, the first three responses to each thread that was emotional support seeking. So essentially we took each, so you imagine like response 1 could be coded level 5, 6 or high, response 2, 5, 6 or high, response 3, 5, 6 or high. And then we submitted that to what's called sequence analysis. And sequence analysis, it started out with DNA sequencing, but people have picked it up in the behavioral sciences. And what it gives you is the different orders in which those messages occurred in the community. And so what those represent then, these sequences represent attractor states, or these states to which the community returns over time. And so we found 12 different sequences, and the sequences, I'm not going to get into we don't have the time to get into the weeds here, but the idea is they have different orders of these message properties. And so we have one with like mostly all level 5, one with all high PC, one with mostly level 6, and then we have mixes. So what we then did is we looked at how the likelihood of a sequence with high person-centeredness, how likely was that to lead to high person-centeredness later in a thread? So again, we have the first three messages in the thread. Are there differences in the degree to which these different sequences produce high person-centeredness in the thread? And then we looked at how the sequence affects the well-being of the support seeker. So every seeker who created a thread had the opportunity to rate their feelings, their level of distress. And they did that with an icon that ranged from like terrible to very good, let's say. There were 5 different levels. And so what we could do is we could say after that thread, so we could look at their feeling for that thread. And then the next time they posted, we could look at their feeling then and see in between how the level of, how the sequence of feedback they receive influence their next, their mood at time 2, let's call it. So what we found was that sequences containing high levels of person-centeredness were more likely to be followed by high PC later in thread. And so what that means is that these sequences formed an attractor state where the system keeps getting pulled back into that state. It has kind of a gravity. So when high PC appeared in the initial sequence, later in the thread, high PC was likely to come up again from another support provider. We also found that people who received high sequences with high VPC or person-centeredness were more likely to self-report a better mood at time 2. So in their next thread, they were more likely to report a mood that was improved, more positive than in their current thread. So right now this looks at like, okay, well, high PC, that seems to be the driver here. Can you give me any evidence the sequences were consequential? And I can, and I'm going to try to do this without getting in the weeds too much. I want to just point out one set of combinations that was important, in that a sequence containing, so the first message was level 6, the second was high PC, the third was high PC. That was better than level 6 high PC, or high PC level 6. And hopefully you're looking at these like, wait, how are these different? The only difference is this one starts with level 6 and then moves to high PC. But we found it was consistently better in terms of being more likely to produce high VPC feedback later, and being more likely to generate a more positive mood. And it's important because this actually maps really nicely onto the theory of conversationally induced reappraisals. That theory outlines a series of rhetorical moves needed to generate reappraisal. And what it says is that in order to be effective, a support seeker needs to first sort of make a provider needs to make a seeker feel comfortable talking about their feelings. And that's kind of what level 6 does. It's non-feeling centered feedback that then moves into feeling centered talk. So following that trajectory where we're going to start with non-feeling centered, then get into feeling centered, is more effective than simply staying on this non-feeling centered, or starting with feeling focused talk first and then moving in the other direction. So we feel like we found like some tentative evidence to suggest that the actual pattern matters as well, and not just this is a high person-centered effect. So the takeaways here from this line of work is that we think that it offers some evidence that support provision can be this group level phenomenon, and that the groups of people who are independent in terms of, they may not even be aware of others' existence as support providers, but for a seeker, it does seem like their responses coalesce into these regular patterns of support provision behavior. And then those patterns are consequential. So those patterns affect the coping responses of support seekers, as well as the behavior of other folks in the community. All right. So what I hope to do now is try to draw some lessons for support research. And I think I've got 3 ideas from the work we've done. One is near and dear to my heart, and it's what do we need to do to provide helpful support? One of the reasons I've been drawn to this area is because I just think it's one of the things in comm that we've learned that could help make the world a better place. And that is, to be helpful, emotional support must be provided effectively. Ideally, we're going to validate and help recipients better understand their feelings. At the very least, let's not deny or criticize feelings. I think that, imagine if we taught that to like elementary school kids. Just don't do that. I think the world would be a better place. So a second lesson then is that, support's co-constructed through conversation. I would doubt that anyone would want to argue me on that point. I think as comm folks, we're all in. We all say, yeah, it's constructed through conversation. How could it not be? But, I don't think we've studied that very often, or at least we haven't studied that very often for folks who do quantitative work. There's certainly some really nice conversation analysis work that's been done, and they've done that. But more broadly, the folks doing the quantitative work have not paid nearly enough attention to that. So the outcomes of support provision are not solely determined by providers, but it's seekers and providers working together to construct a supportive interaction. And I would think the outcomes seekers ultimately experience. Last but not least, support is not just simply a dyadic phenomenon, but it can emerge from collectives. And if you think about things like some Tammy Afifi's work on communal coping, which I was just reading, you can think about how support might fit in that as this, in that line of work, as this collective phenomenon of people acting in concert. So with that, I will thank you very much for your time today, and I'd love to open the floor to questions and hear what you think.
All right, folks, you can, how about you raise your hand virtually, or use the raise hand button, and then we should be able to see your questions. Oh, we got one from Katie. Go ahead, Katie. Yourself. Katie.
Thank you. If a student has a question, I want them to ask. Also, my question isn't about this set of studies.
Okay.
So, but as you began and you started really going into social support and how it is like one of the most commonly studied concepts in comm across the social sciences. Everybody is into it. Everyone's interested in it. And you talked about how supportive communication is a distinct line of work. But as someone who is sort of on the fringes, that sometimes I use social support in my work and I read it and then I get reviews back and I feel like within the social support, supportive communication community, there's something going on that I don't really get. It's like some gatekeeping or some territoriality that like people, for example, like if a graduate student's like, yeah, I did this great study and I used Kerr and Sahona, or is that right? Sir and
Petrona and Spur, yeah.
Petrona and Sir, thank you. I was slipping their first initials, and all these reviewers ate me alive on that. I'm like, oh yeah, that isn't cool anymore. You're not supposed to do that. They're like, how was I supposed to know? So there's something going on. And as you were beginning your talk, you were kind of getting into it. And I thought, oh, finally, I'm going to know what is the deal with the sort of challenges for folks who are studying this stuff, but that everybody else feels like that they can just pop in and like, use a 30-year-old conceptual definition and 45-year-old operationalizations, and they're good to go. So if you could kind of continue where you started and give us a little bit of that, you're going to make me so happy because I have been wondering this for years.
I will say, Katie, that's something I've also felt and experienced, and it was part of the reason. One of the things that led me to person-centeredness initially is that you're right. There is a segment of comm folks who do the communication focused work that's about constructing effective support messages, and so that has very much been that message has been front and center, and so sometimes work that does support through the lens of receive, perceived, or the network's perspective doesn't get. It's not that it doesn't get. It's not taken seriously. It's just that it's maybe seen as coming from outside of the field. So yeah, I think there is some gatekeeping there. I think that's a totally great point. I want to add the one other experience I've had in working in the support domain that's unlike any other domain I've ever worked in, and this is a positive, and it just blew me away initially. They are the nicest reviewers ever. Like, even though they're very critical of your paper, they do it in such a face-sensitive way that it's like you get a rejection and you feel good about it. That's been some of my experience there, where it's like, I cannot believe how nice these rejections are. And I think it's because they're very attuned to that kind of language. But yeah, I think you make a good point. There definitely is some, I don't want to say, I don't know if gatekeeping is the right word, but they're camps. And as with any area, you've got to be aware of the camps, and you have to sort of figure out, how do I construct a piece so I can not offend other camps, but work within the camp I want to. That's a great point.
Well, thank you for resolving some of the mystique around it. And it is interesting. That is a great point, that those reviewers, they note that their message should be validating, and this. So I guess it's spoonful of sugar sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The feedback I see is like, okay, great. You've looked at different types of support, okay, advice, or informational, emotional esteem, that kind of thing. And it's like, well, what about the quality of those messages? Is usually the kind of generic feedback.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This mystery solved, or at least resolved.
Barry, do you want to go ahead? Barry?
I do. And after I stop talking, Steve, if you would stop sharing the screen so we can see a bigger picture of you, but not yet, not while I'm talking. Oh, no. Okay, that's good too. So thank you so much for that. The presentation was actually a model. I loved how you set up the whole area of social support, and then your particular concern with supportive communication around emotional support. Beautifully done. And I found your studies really so intriguing. I learned from them, and I like the fact that you really show how your work helps to build in the area, add more information so that we have a better sense of what this process is about. So thank you very much for that. I've done a little bit of work with Coulter Ray, who is sort of on the other side of this. So he's been interested in when people don't give support to someone when it's sort of expected. And more recently, we did one, and again, I'm sort of helped with him, but these are his studies where he was actually interested in when low person-centered support has more positive outcomes. So kind of pushing back a little bit on that, like it's always better to be sort of validating. And kind of the combination that I saw, especially with one that Coulter did with Christina Sharp, where it was a qualitative study where they were trying to understand the reasons why people did not give support. And one of those is like, this person has been asking for support for so long, they never make any changes. I'm just so tired of it. It's not going to make any difference if I do. And then in the lowest support, part of what was looking at was sort of the sense of, is this message accurate? And if it's accurate and it's given by someone who's close to them and a couple other things, it can have positive effects. And part of that is like, sometimes people, like most of the time we want to be totally validated, but sometimes people need to be invalidated, especially if we think it's hurting them, and especially in something like a health context. So I just am curious how you think about that when I love that you're promoting sort of the positive things, and most of the time it's good. What is sort of your thinking around when we might not want to do this?
Thank you. It's great seeing you. That's an awesome question. I love Coulter's work. So when we did the listener bot studies, we had used a prolific sample, and I got a call on my office phone, and someone left a message in there, and they were like, I know what you're trying. It was like a really excited person. I know what you're trying to do. You can't just tell people what they want to hear. You have to tell them what they need to hear. And I was like, okay, that was a lot. I think though, I would push back a little, and I would say you can still do it in a way that doesn't invalidate their feelings. So, because I guess if the person is truly upset, you could say, I understand you're upset. But I also think if we put, and try to put it in the broader context where you don't tell them they're overreacting, but you try to, walk them into that idea. So I would think that there's still ways you could do that. But the things that Coulter have done, and I know I obviously collaborated with them about when support is not helpful or not effective. I do think there are times, though, at the opposite, where the high level stuff can be not helpful because it's not what people wanted. So it could fit the form of high person centeredness, but not be what they want to hear. You may get someone who wants to hear for whatever reason, they like to be told they're overreacting, or that resonates with them. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but and if there's a way that I can, please let me know and I'll try to expand. But I think that this issue of, you're right, I did paint it like, let's never do low person centeredness, but I think you're right. It's totally valuable to study and see, maybe there is a subset of context where it is beneficial. It reminds me of Graham Bodie has a study where he did physiological responses, and he did it before test taking. And I think he found that low person centeredness was better there than high person centeredness in that unique context of people didn't want to get into a whole bunch of stuff about it was speech anxiety. They just wanted to be kind of told, go out there and suck it up and talk.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I agree with that too. And I do think your process-oriented view is really helpful in this too, that if you're thinking of a person who's been talking about some issue or dealing with an issue over time in a relationship, and they've tried all of these other ones, and then finally they need to do something different. That would be a context in which sometimes the real critical low person-centered support would be the sort of only option left. But you don't get there right away. So I like your idea about even if you're trying to be direct with them, and you can still do it in a way that supports their emotional experience while saying, but yeah. So thank you for that.
I think what you've also pointed to is I've sort of focused a lot of my attention on within a conversation, but I think there's another level with multiple conversations over time in a relationship, which absolutely would be awesome to study too, and we don't have a ton of research on that.
Okay, Dr. Betty Cohen, unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Betty. I'm studying public health genetics, but I study online communities for that. So I'm conducting a study similar to the fibromyalgia one you showed. And I am using Catriona and Sir's framework, but perhaps I'm a little wary about that now. But my question for you is how you deal with the subjective definitions of emotional support. One of the examples you gave seems to me that the person was looking for maybe a response of maybe a shared experience or more factual information. And so from my understanding, I would maybe think of that as this person's looking for information. And to me, validation may not go to someone's emotions, but maybe because I've been thinking about that in this context, maybe esteem. And so I'm curious how you think about the subjectivity of definitions, especially when you're using computational methods to calculate the differences in types of responses.
Well, I will say that we found about half of the messages in our sample, we coded for informational and emotional for a couple of different studies. And about half of the messages in our sample included both. And if you think about the unit of analysis, there's no way to chunk. So like a thread starting message that's its own unit, right? There's no way to chunk that because people who are responding to it are responding to the whole message. And so it's true that there probably are informational support queries in an emotional support seeking message. And so we just said, well, because they have emotional support, they're fair game for emotional support. Whether or not people choose to provide it, they may not. And in our scheme, that would go into like a level 6 of a non-feeling centered explanation. In your situation, it sounds like though that, if you do have messages that could be both, that might create an opportunity for like a new, for a category that has both. But it is tricky. I definitely agree that it's not clear cut. And I know there are a number of content analyses where it appears to be clear cut in the sense of when people report what they found, they said, well, this is just one or the other. I've even reviewed some where they'll say, we had 70 emotional and 60 informational. It's like, how are they? And what they'll come up with is they use the dominant message in the message, which has always never been totally clear to me. But so I think there's a different way to handle it. But it's not, I think it is an ongoing challenge we face.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like some people also try to do like a percent agreement metric to try to show at least your multiple coders agreed.
Oh,
but
yeah, for sure.
To me, that's not even enough because I'm training my coders, right? So like they're just learning from the definitions that I'm proposing. But those definitions might not actually be like accurate or what anyone else in the field thinks. So,
and there was one other thing that came out of sort of this work was that one of the things we noticed is what people go online for is they want to hear about others' experiences, right? And so if I ask you, can anybody give me how hard was it going back to work with this condition? And I want to know about your experience. And I'm asking you for your experience. Some people who, purists would say person-centeredness, if you as a provider are talking about your experience, that's low person-centeredness. But we would say, no. They ask for their experience. And by giving them their experience and talking about their own feelings, they're normalizing those feelings for the seeker. So I think you can also make the case that there's some contextual constraints that would allow you to adapt the coding scheme to make it appropriate. You probably get pushback on that, but I don't know what else to do. That's what I've done.
thank you. That was really helpful.
All right, I have a question. Right. So it's fascinating to listen to your talk and your study, Steve. But I have a question about advice and more task aspect or task-oriented aspect in support communication, because when you think about offering support, yes, emotion support is very important, but oftentimes it's also because the support seeker needs some help. They need to solve a problem, right? And no matter how you validate their emotion, some concrete advice, some solution to the problem probably also needs to provide it. So I'm just curious about what your thought about these more task-oriented aspect of support, which you also mentioned, informational support and all of these. Could that also be connected to the idea of person-centeredness and also and also emotional support in general?
I think what happens is it gets lumped into the level 6 part. Well, so it gets lumped into moderate person-centeredness, and it's just defined as like non-feeling centered situation appraisal or suggestion for action. But then there's also the whole separate body of research on advice from Arena McGeorge and Bo Feng, who right? Has done a bunch of stuff that runs in parallel to the person-centeredness. It's almost like they're two worlds. You've got, if it's emotional, it's person-centeredness. If it's advice, it's been into their model. So I think there's definitely a potential for overlap for sure, because I've seen there are a few recent studies. I think Bo did some where she looked at the effect of providing emotional support and then advice, I believe. So there is a potential for connection there, and it would make sense, right, in an everyday setting that most people don't just want one, they're looking for multiple things.
Yeah, so that's also kind of, when you're saying that sometimes people, you should tell them not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. That also kind of implies an expectation for solution of problem. But I do think that providing emotional support is maybe the first thing you wanted to, to do, and then maybe followed with a little bit more of the concrete solutions.
Yeah, and I will say though, I think the person-centeredness, what it's all focused on is relief from emotional distress. So it doesn't really care. It wants to make you feel better in the moment.
Okay.
And the way you go about doing that is by helping people to think about their resources as being more robust, or to think about the problem as being more manageable.
Thank you. Right. We also have questions from Anne and then Yue. And do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have a question of can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. Like what category would fall under for like the advice that I've gotten that is like before you sort of give support or give advice, you ask them, it's like, oh, do you want me to listen right now or do you want me to give advice? Like what would that just straight up asking it to just explicitly? Because I know that's also a thing instead of just jumping right into advice or support.
Yeah, asking people what they want. I've not
Yeah.
seen any studies on that, but that would be a really cool study. I mean, I think that's something that's an empirical question. I love it.
Okay.
I don't
Okay,
know.
cool. Great.
I think that you definitely could run with that in the context of a simple scenario-based project where you have one condition where they do that and one condition where they just jump in with advice, or
Right.
they
Or
one
with
really
emotional, yeah. Do you want hug or help? Like that's a pretty common thing. I was curious like what category that would fall under just before even going into either asking them which one they want. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. I let me know when you send me the DOI when you get that published.
The DOI, oh man.
By the way,
Professor
yeah, I just want to say that Anne is actually an undergrad student in my class. She's one of the good students, and she's really into research. And I'm glad that she's asking that question.
That's great.
Professor Liao, help me.
I think that's a wonderful idea you have.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and maybe I just want to, I know Yue has a question, but I just want to quite quickly say, maybe it's related to this idea of, avoid unsolicited advice, so that people may have a concern about that. So, offer people a choice between help or hug might be related to that. Yeah. Yue.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I'm a postdoc working next door in the information school at UW, but my PhD is from COM, and I went to the same program with FOM. And my question is like regarding the kind of validation message or like the emotional support people provide, whether that's like a relative idea or like there's like a absolute value, like if you provide like this level of validation, you are going to make people absolutely feel better, or it's like relative to the expectation like the receiver perceive like the communicator is having. So like for example, my dad, like an Asian middle-aged man who probably don't know how to provide emotional support very well, like if he just give me a little bit of validation, I will think, wow, that's like the whole world to me. But if I'm facing, some American, like very passionate, like mental health and supporter, and who I just expect them to have like, oh yeah, they provide lots of like, validation, emotional support. So like if they provide the same level of the kind of validation my dad can provide, I might feel like, yeah, this is what it has to be. So I wonder if this kind of like message or like emotional support they provide, is there's the absolute value, or you think that's like relative to the kind of expectation you perceive for the other people that can provide?
You know what? I think that's a fantastic question. I think that's another like empirical question, because I've been thinking about validation as simply dichotomous. It's either there or it's not. But you're right. You could dig into the quality of validation and the extent of validation. Could you imagine I can imagine a hedged validation? Well, I think that's a pretty reasonable. I think it's pretty reasonable to be upset there versus it's definitely reasonable to be upset. So I think that's something that would be an interesting project to really dig into validation. And I think the value of that would be it would help us unpack a little bit more the mechanism that's driving the effects of validation.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like, expectancy violation, that kind of thing. So like how much validation you expect this like communicator can provide versus the amount like they are actually like validating, and whether like such discrepancy can cause like more feeling validated versus less feeling validated, that kind of research question.
Yeah, and you're right, and that's something I wasn't even considering. Is you're right. There's the receiver side. What do they expect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also wonder, like
you
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I don't. I mean, I just think that's a great point and would definitely be worthy of study.
Yeah, and I just want to know, like maybe in one of your future like meta-analysis, because I cited like so many of your meta-analysis in the past, maybe if you study some sort of like, this validation, emotional support, maybe like some cultural moderators might also be included in one of those like future analysis to say, oh, like East Asian culture, like people's expectation versus like American culture or whatever, that kind of like, meta level moderators, like how then they might be like included or like considered in those analyses.
Okay, I will do that, but I don't understand why I have to do all the work. I would love to see you pursue that because it is a great idea. And then looking at cultural differences and how that would be shaped. I do have with Shelby Carter, we have a chapter coming out in Annals of ICA. It's about support seeking, and we have a section on culture. And then the reason I'm talking about is because at the end we talk about we need absolutely that. It would be great to see more research building on how cultural expectations kind of shape support seeking behavior and responses to it. So I think you're right. That's absolutely a great idea, and I would love to see that pursued.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is super helpful, and I look forward to continue our conversations at ICA or in the future.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah, Leilani, go ahead.
Actually, my question is related to the last one. I was wondering, I was really fascinated by the online experiment, and I was wondering if you could, how much you told the people who were interacting with the chatbot. Like, did they believe that there was some connection between what they said and the response they got? Like, they, it was combing through all the possible responses and saying, oh, yes, this is what you're saying is completely normal, or what you're saying is, overreacting.
So we asked a question that was like that I believe I interacted with the chatbot, strongly agree, strongly disagree. And then we asked, I believe I interacted with a human posing as a chatbot. And they thought they were interacting with the chatbot. No one was suspicious at all. And I think part of the reason for that is because the chatbot, you saw it, was so clumsily developed, like it was so terrible. It's so unsophisticated that I think it seemed like it was something that somebody might be able to come up with on a campus. So I got the sense that and they're also digital natives too, because they were all undergraduate students. So my sense is that they thought they brought their expectations for an interaction with the chatbot to that is what I am under the impression. So are you thinking like, what were you thinking if we were to manipulate that we would have gotten?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wonder if they might have been like when they got a response that was saying, oh, you're overreacting, that the chatbot was actually somehow scraping a lot of data, like looking at a bunch of across a bunch of websites, and by doing that could then determine whether this person was overreacting or not, right? So that the chatbot wasn't simply an automated response, but that was somehow working from whatever collected data.
Yeah, I don't think I don't know that they were making that assumption. I think if anything, they were thinking the chatbot is super basic and just spitting out generic stuff.
Yeah.
But that's what we were going for, though, because we were trying to like make it seem as unperson centered as possible, as generic as possible. But that would be a different way to test it and would get at like a more of a human computer interaction kind of how perceptions of that technology are shaping your interaction with it. we did it. One of the other studies I put up, we manipulated the helpfulness of the chatbot. We basically said, this chatbot's been tested rigorously and it's been given 5 stars by 900 students, or this chatbot's been only tested once or twice and most people found it unhelpful. And we found it main effect for person-centeredness, but we also found that perceptions of the chatbot mattered as well. It shaped their perceptions of the interaction.
Any final questions from the audience? We're also kind of approaching to the end, or actually we exceeded the typical ending time. Oh, Katie, go ahead.
Another somewhat off-topic question, but since we have you here, Steve, how on earth are you so productive? You have stuff coming out so often, and I have wondered this, that you just apparently do not sleep. So if you have any secrets or tips, I'm sure we would all benefit from hearing them.
That's very, very kind, Katie. Very kind. My tip is I have really excellent co-authors. That's part of it, I think. And then some of it is just doing the same thing over and over. It gets faster. Do you know what I mean? Like as a graduate student, I remember how long, like as an MA student, how long it took to write that first paper. And then you get in the doctoral program, it goes a little faster, and assistant. And then now, you're kind of, it's all the same paper almost. So I think it goes faster because, if like the first lit review you wrote, it was like, oh man, I can't believe I did that. And then now it's like, oh, I did that this afternoon because, so I think just that's a big part of it. And the other thing too is, to be honest with you, like a lot of you, for you grad students, the best thing about being a professor is that you never really have to go to work. I mean, if you love what you do, you have the best job in the world, and it makes it one where it's not onerous and you're not like, oh, it's 4:58, I got 2 more minutes. You're like, oh no, I only have 2 more minutes. So I think that's a big part of it too, is that, having jobs we love, it makes it really easy the work kind of does itself.
Well, I am always impressed. And even when I can tell also that you do a lot of mentoring of undergrads too. And so I always appreciate, I can't remember, it was probably like 2 or 3 years ago, you had this great content analysis. I think it was on Grey's Anatomy or something, a really nice content analysis study that you could see that undergrads were very involved. And I assign it to undergrads. And so we talk about this, and you gave them authorship and things. So I can see that you are really, that not only good being strategic with co-authors, but that probably from mentorship that some of those come out too.
Oh yeah. And that one actually is a good example of a co-author, because Brian Quick is the first author on that. So we were, he's great. Excellent comm scholar.
Yeah, undergrads love that paper though.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah.
Good, clean conceptual definitions, good, there's manifest and latent variables. So it's always a good one.
And I believe that Grey's Anatomy is set in Seattle, right? Is that correct?
Oh yes, that is probably another reason why our students like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Katie. That's very kind.
Okay. Well, it seems like we already exceeded the typical ending time. Usually we end at 1 hour and 15 minutes, and we almost spent like 90 minutes on this. So thank you very much for the talk, Dr. Rains. Now, as I mentioned before, actually, Dr. Rains had kindly agreed to stay a little bit longer after the talk. But of course, I know others, you all have your own schedules. So we will just do a 1 round of applause. Thank you for Dr. Rains' presentation. And then if you are interested to learn a little bit more of Dr. Rains' secret in terms of being productive and prolific and enjoying research, please stick around, especially for grad students. I think it's going to be very helpful.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.